when the cancer comes, the experts will gather. They will say things like, I'm afraid there's bad news. This is not a death sentence. People live long lives. We are doing everything we can, but there is not an exact science to this. You will, of course, hear bad news. You will hear this is a death sentence. You will think to yourself, humans are everything but not this. Cancer is when the abnormal cells grow and spread very quickly. Sometimes these cells group together, forming tumors, causing damage to healthy parts of the body. Often, those cells break off, causing more damage to other healthy parts of the body. And this is the best definition of gentrification I have. I live in Oakland, where they're tearing down old black bodies quicker than they could build up new high-rises. Death by crooked cop or crooked crane is all the same. Gentrification is killing us. When the new Oakland residents call the cops on the drum circle filled with people of color, they're trying to stop the heartbeat. When they call the cops on the black church, which had been there for 65 years for being too loud on a Sunday, they're trying to strip Oakland of its soul. To gentrify is to take the body and gut it. It is to treat the entire city like a chop house, and those butchers have no manners. They do not pray over the slaughtered. They do not even have the decency to make use of the entire carcass. They simply toss out the bones as if there's no need to season the stock. There is no God in this. My stepfather was a pastor. And before that, he was a football coach. And before that, he was a truck driver who delivered food items. He was a man who took care of those who were not his own. He was a high yellow man, a log cabin of a father who sang like he tried to call the cattle home. He thought his voice was better than what it was. And we let him sing anyway, because we knew that soon he would go the same way of the house he raised us in. All memory, no longer ours, no longer here. When my mother called me to tell me of his lymphoma, that he has a few months left to live, for some odd reason, I thought of the newly built high-rise just up the street for mixed-income families. I thought to myself, the city does not care that the lower-income families in that mixed-income high-rise will never be able to afford the $5 cup of coffee or to shop at the Whole Foods. The cancer does not care that the body will never be whole or that the body has a family. The city does not care about black families. The only place we have ever called home will be made to feel strange and foreign and out of place, that at this rate we will have to lower our dead into grounds they could not afford to live on at some point. Mixed-income housing only prolongs the inevitable, and this is the best definition of chemotherapy I have. Meanwhile, my stepfather died, and no one seemed to ask the important questions like how did we get here? And why is the body eating itself alive? And where did the God go in all of this? I am a broken prayer in a burned down church house. Without him, I never would have made it, which is to say I am black and I am scared. And this is exactly what the cancer does. It pushes the God out of the body, and sometimes the body has neighborhoods for limbs, which is to say, when I played football for him, and we lost our semifinal game, and I made my fist into two small wrecking balls, waiting for any new project to get into, he said, yeah, I know this one hurts. Cry it out if you have to, but you got to keep your head up, you hear me? You got to figure out a way to get him next time. He is everything I can tell you about gentrification. He is everything I know about what happens when the cancer finally comes. Shortly before my stepfather passed, he called my siblings and I into the room to have a conversation. He told us not to worry, that he'll be all right, that he knows God and God got his back. As you might imagine, his words did nothing to stop our tears or ease our pain. As he laid there in the bed, he informed us that he secretly took out an insurance policy on himself and will be leaving each of us with a relatively small inheritance. He said, it's not much. I don't want you all to spend it in one place. I want you to do something good with the money. And as we all sat there crying, I yelled out, no, fuck that. I'm buying rims and I'm buying jewelry and I'm putting rims on my rims. And for a second, we all laughed. When he called us all into the room individually to speak with us, he told me, thank you. That's who you are, Jay. Always keep them laughing. I wrote that poem, When the Cancer Comes, about my stepfather, Pastor Foster T. Maharis, in 2016 during a time I lived in Oakland. At the moment, I was struggling with my stepfather's imminent death, the rampant murder of black people at the hands of the state all over, and the seemingly unstoppable death of an iconic black city, what the locals have come to affectionately call the town. From the newly constructed buildings to increased housing costs, from the infamous Barbecue Becky to the 2014 mayoral race, in which many candidates called for the increased police presence, there was no doubt about ridding the city of its so-called undesirable black and brown populations from the newly large influx of white populations to what the East Bay Express called the, quote, rapid de-blackening of the East Bay's urban core, end quote. Gentrification in Oakland, as it is in many urban areas throughout the U.S., was and is aggressively and dangerously anti-black and anti-poor. I knew I couldn't save my stepfather. So instead, I turned my attention to Oakland, and I began to feverishly read and write so much about gentrification. I began to also record the stories of Oakland's black residents about how their homes and livelihoods were being taken from them, not entirely different than the way my stepfather was being taken from my family. I became a poet in high school when a particularly attractive classmate of mine came up to me out of nowhere and said, "Javon, I heard you write poems." And at that point, I hadn't written a poem, and I was ready to tell her that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And before I could, she was like, "I think it's so sexy." So I was like, "What's up, girl? I write poems." True story, right? That night, I had the opportunity to go home and become a liar or a poet, and so I chose the latter. And I wrote for her what I'm absolutely certain was an awful love poem. My classmates seemed to like my writing so much so that many of them began to pay me to write poems for their partners. And it was in this moment that I understood the power of creativity, the power of poetry, and I began to write about other things. I began to write about police brutality, about drugs, about gang violence, about poverty, and about systemic disenfranchisement, and about a bunch of other things that I didn't know how to name just yet, but I knew them to be true in my bones. In this way, poetry not only allowed me to be an author, but in some ways it allowed me to become authoritative over my own life. Now, I critically and creatively write all the time. I also read a lot. I teach students how to write both inside the classroom and outside the classroom. I teach them to write poems and essays, and I demand that they refuse the separation between the artistic and the academic. I say all of this to tell you, I think about writing every day. And writing, for me, is a process where you place sentences in a proper sequence. Whenever a single sentence is read aloud, it should be easily comprehensible. Clear and concise sentences are almost always preferable. Example, Javon smiles. See? Javon is the proper noun in that sentence, but can be easily replaced by the noun boy. Smiles is the action verb. It does something in the world. If you want to get fancy and color that sentence up, throw in an adjective just before the noun. Adverbs, on the other hand, should almost always follow the verb in which they're used to describe. Example, the black boy smiles largely. See? It should be noted that in this poem, the black boy is the sentence, not the sentenced. The black boy is not a lesson in court construction or how the judicial system railroads black families. In this poem, the black boy is the subject, the sentence, the object. The object lesson here being is that our court construct their sentences opposite grammatical law. It is incorrect. It is incorrect for a judge to state, I'm going to go with the state's recommendation and sentence you to X amount of years. Rather, whenever we consider an event that have occurred to be unfinished and can therefore always happen again, we should use perfect present tense conjugation. In this way, a judge might better state the state has been recommending and been sentencing the black boy for years. I used to think, y'all. I used to think when I was a child, I wanted to conquer the world. Like any mediocre white man we would later call great, I thought my life too worthy of a state-sanctioned monument, which is to say, I believed in the American dream. I pledged allegiance, believed in blind justice. Years ago, I testified in court as a character witness for a friend because I thought all my fancy degrees would matter. The judge gave him a decade for a felony he likely did not commit. But even if he did, what exactly does that sentence say? What exactly does that sentence mean? His mother wept uncontrollably. The court, a musty Klan's robe before he he turned to us. He was shackled, but the black boy could not smile. The black boy could not smile. The black boy could not. And isn't that a proper sentence too? Clear, concise, but somehow too long, like the sentences black folk are always given. However, it is incorrect to say that the black boy was jailed. It is passive. It lacks a subject. Who jailed the black boy? Who jailed the black boy? The racist system jailed him harshly. See? The placement of the adjective, noun, verb, and adverb. See? Who's doing all the action here? See? No mention of the black girl. How easily she gets erased. See exactly how they teach us to construct a proper sentence. Thank you. Whenever I write poems, I am often asked, why do I do this? Sometimes I read and write and perform poems out of duty. That is, past black generations work for my freedoms, therefore I must do my part, however small, to work for the freedoms of future black generations. Sometimes I feel like I do it out of honor or because I'm blessed with the opportunity or because I have fun doing it, but often I simply settle at the fact that I do not know how not to create, how not to write about the world that exists and the one that I desperately need and want to exist in a world that disenfranchises black folks at every chance it gets, one that is excessively more vile and violent towards black women, black trans folk, black queer folk, and black children. I am still often amazed that people find my voice valid and valuable. I use my poetry to interrogate and unpack things, to search for deeper truth. And this is the power of the arts. The way they open up space for us to imagine and work towards a world we previously thought impossible. How they demand us even to envision beyond the power of the state, and the way they continuously give us power to work and think and act on the world differently than we did before. If this were not so, how else are we to understand Plato's call for the death of the poets in his so-called perfect republic? The U.S. culture wars in the late 80s and 90s, the divestment in the arts in poor black and brown schools, or the ways in which certain media strategically ignored Arabic hip-hop during the Arab uprisings. Even now, to quote USC professor Tara McPherson, the U.S. president recently proposed eliminating the budgets for 2 national agencies that fund the arts and humanities. Never mind that the combined budget for these 2 programs is roughly $300 million per year, a mere 0.008% of the federal budget. By way of comparison, France spends $3.2 billion with a B on its culture of ministry. Or, to take a different approach, a single F-35 fighter costs roughly $130 million. And the budget for that largely failing program is over $1.5 trillion. In other words, our government would rather spend an obscene amount of money on defense than to put a drop in a bucket to imagine and work towards a world that might not need it. In this way, I challenge all of my students to not simply write, but to create art that calls us to a more just and loving world. You know, this past summer, my younger brother and his best friend celebrated their 1-year anniversary for their clothing company in Amor Noir, Los Angeles, and I couldn't have been more proud. I, along with a couple of poet friends of mine, were on hand to read poems and help usher in a new campaign that featured our words on their clothing. It was so beautiful to see my baby brother tap into his creativity. My mother brilliantly and bravely raised 2 black boys in 1980s and 90s South Central. My mom, with her big smile, she has a gap tooth. She hates that I talk about it, but I love it so much. My mom, with her big smile, is the kind of woman who paints and bedazzles everything. She has a knack for making the plain and inexpensive look fabulous. She recently told me that when I was a child, I wanted a Smurf-themed birthday party, but she couldn't afford the entire thing, so she bought the decorations and told herself she could make the cake. After having successfully pulled that off, she later moved to creating clothing and jazzing up furniture. My mom modeled for her boys, one a poet performer and the other a fashion designer, the power of creativity. She taught us that beauty and art and joy and love are things that can and must be created through sustained practice. My mother opened up the space for her boys to be creative and continually be recreated in our own creativity, which allowed for healthier Black masculine possibilities. I still think about my mother's call quite often. The crack in her voice, the slow and deliberate tone, but yet still so caring. She said, "You gotta come home now. We gotta have a family talk." I secretly avoided my regular trips home to Los Angeles because I had hoped that if I delayed going home, I could somehow delay my stepfather's passing. I never wrote myself out of that fear because I do not believe that writing is always a search for a way out. Instead, I wrote myself deeper into the pain, the hurt, the anger, the loss, and it was in that place, in that painful place, that I was able to tap into the kinds of feelings that allowed me to become a more emotionally voluminous cis-het Black man, one who is now able to cry and be cried for. So when I say poetry saved my life, I mean I am absolutely certain I would not be here if not for art. I challenge each of us here to be more creative, to make a dance, sing songs, write poems, paint, build furniture, and find your joy. I truly believe creativity matters. It does something in the world, and I am living proof of that. To quote my former professor, D. Soini Madison, "I'm not saying one performance will change the world. I am saying, however, performances can amass like snowflakes to bring forth an avalanche of material change." Thank you very much.